This is the Next Level Podcast with Jeff Augustinelli, episode 29. Welcome to the Next Level Podcast, where each week I'll sit down with an exceptional entrepreneur, author, thought leader, speaker, or leader in their field to bring you insights and strategies to help you bring your life to the next level. Do you feel there's never enough time and suffer from overwhelm, stress, anxiety, and feeling run down? Well, I've put together a free ebook to help you create the peace of mind you've been searching for. Just head over to jeffa.co/guide to grab your free copy of A Beginner's Guide to Overcoming Anxiety, even if you don't think you have it. What's happening, Next Level listeners? In this episode, I'll sit down with Dr. Zach Bush to talk about glyphosate, GMOs, and how to restore your health. This was a very enlightening episode for me and really broke open what happened with agriculture, the advent of genetically modified organisms or GMOs, glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, and really what happens with the human health condition as a result of Frankenstein agriculture, if you will. In today's episode, we're going to dive into topics like how we've been on an unsustainable journey to date, Dr. Bush's transition from academia and medicine to his new Revolution Health Center, the harmful nature of the quote-unquote medical toolbox, the shocking truth of the medical industry, Dr. Bush's journey through different disciplines of medicine, coming to the point where you ask, what do I know for sure? We're also going to get into what the impact of GMOs is on our health and our gut health specifically, an insight into an autistic generation, a brief evolution of agriculture and soil, and so much more. Dr. Bush and the team at Restore for Life, with the advent of the Restore product, are creating a lot of waves in the health industry. In this episode, we're going to dive into a lot of the science behind the Restore product, what it does in the body, and I think you're really going to love what we've put together for you today. If you're into the conversation of health, if you're privy to gluten intolerance and really any other health deficiency that stems from the gut, which is most, I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. And I know for me, it gave me a whole new level of understanding as to what the potentials are, where they come from, and what to do about it. I hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Bush just as much as I enjoyed sitting down with him. Now let's dig in. Welcome back, Next Level listeners. Today, my guest is Dr. Zach Bush. Zach Bush, MD, is one of the few triple board certified physicians in the country with specialties of internal medicine, endocrinology and metabolism, and hospice and palliative care. President of the student body at the University of Colorado, then chief resident at the University of Virginia, his achievements include award-winning cell biology, clinical care, and medical education. But the most compelling part of his journey really started when, after 17 years in academic medicine, he made a radical leap to start a nutrition-based education clinic in rural Virginia. Since that moment in 2010, Dr. Bush has created a multidisciplinary team of scientists and clinicians that has revealed a unifying science behind the devastating changes in the food, farming, and medical industries. Equipped with this growing body of science and clinical experience, Dr. Bush is quickly becoming a national authority in our modern disease epidemics and their common root in the chemical herbicide glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup. In his continued mission for public health education, he has proven himself to be a gifted educator to a broad range of audiences. From mothers to farmers to national physician symposiums, his information and clear delivery has created shockwaves of change and hope in individuals and communities. Dr. Bush, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Jeff, thanks so much for having us, and I'm really pleased to be a part of your community. Taking it to another level here is an exciting concept, so excited for the discourse to go here.
Awesome, man. And you are a man of many suits and one that has traveled a long road, my friend. So congratulations on this amazing journey, and I'm very excited to dive in here today.
Thank you so much. It's not one that I planned out, that's for sure.
I'm sure life is one of those things that kind of leads us a lot of the time. And it sounds like each time you've said, okay, cool, let's find out how that goes.
I wish I had said, okay, cool. A lot of times it's more like, oh,
I love that, dude. So honest. That's the best ever. Beautiful. Awesome, Dr. Bush. So what was really, like, let's dive into the transition point, when you were kind of in the academic in university model, and then you decided to really start this Revolution Health Center in Virginia. What did that transition look like for you?
So the journey from academic medicine to where I am today has been anything but linear. It has been one of many, many different shapes and forms that has kind of informed and educated me. The journey has educated me as much as any of my mentors and content from the medicine field ever did, I think. And I think your whole group, you're really focused on something in your own lives, which is taking thought, taking performance, taking spiritual energy to another level. And we look around ourselves, whether it's in medicine and this incredible health crisis we have going on in this world, whether it's the autistic children at 1 in 40 or the Alzheimer's dementia and everything in between, or we turn to the politics or the financial crisis that we have in the United States with staggering debt. Wherever we look, it's clear that we have been on an unsustainable journey to date. And it was that growing sense of, I'm not getting to the bottom of anything, which was really driving my education. I don't think anybody ever sets out to say, you know what, I want to do 17 years of education and take that many tests and everything else. That would be insanity. And so instead, I was on a pursuit of really trying to figure something out that was going to really stick and make a difference in the lives of my patients and therefore a difference in my life. You take a Hippocratic oath at the beginning of medical school. It says, I'm going to do no harm. And as a medical doctor, you have to start setting up these mental and energetic spiritual boundaries pretty quickly to defend yourself from the reality that everything you do is causing harm. We have a pharmacy and a medical intervention toolbox that is inherently harmful. Any commercial you hear, the side effects last 10 minutes, even talking at high speed. So it's clear from an early stage of practicing medicine that, wow, this is not a benign undertaking. I am not a benign arbiter of health. You're really given tools at a very early professional age, if you will, that are dangerous. And you see that happen. Even in your first year of internship, you see medical disasters happen. And so I, like every physician, was going through a process of putting up defense mechanisms, convincing myself that, okay, we do these toxic things because there's no other choice. And ultimately, that's pretty easy to believe if you think we're asking the right questions. And that's basically, I think, where all of us as doctors get to where we are when we practice medicine, which is, everybody's sick, everybody's dying, the environment's totally toxic, and there's nothing I can do about that as a doctor. And so the best I can do is give these, double-edged sword drugs and interventions that I know have a harmful side, but they do and can have a beneficial side. And so you kind of try to take the good with the bad. You try to believe your good is outweighing the bad, and you push on. But that was basically, in a nutshell, I think what led me down the different journeys. First into internal medicine, where I was really trying to learn the foundation of what we knew about human health, what we knew about the science of disease and getting well. And after rising to the chief resident level, where I was just teaching lots of medical residents, lots of medical students, participating at the faculty level in the big academic machine, it was pretty clear that I had lost track of what health meant or how to bring about health. All I was getting good at was controlling disease. And our language in medicine is really shaped around that. We now call it disease management. That's actually what we're taught, is chronic disease management. And that's probably a very true statement, in that we're not bringing about health, we're just managing disease. And that ultimately is not very rewarding. So those were some of the bumper blocks that kind of got me down that pathway of thinking maybe I was not at the root cause of anything. Maybe I needed to start to shift my perspective.
And Doc, what did that transition look like though? Because I mean, you're talking about a big shift, going from that type of world to, having your own health center where you're just doing, amazing work in a brand new way. I mean, did you have any insecurities or, doubt, just things going on when you made that shift?
That's all I had, insecurities and doubt. That's what I started my companies on, I think, in an odd way. I had, there was a few moments in my academic career where the blinders started to come off. First, in my research, I was doing medical research in cancer as an endocrinologist, practicing medicine around hormones, so bone disease, diabetes, thyroid disease. Ultimately, I specialized in pituitary disorders. Pituitary gland is often called the master gland. Sits at the base of the brain, driven by the central nervous system. It really sets up all the hormone responsiveness and communication throughout all the other endocrine glands in the body. And that pituitary gland is prone to tumors. And so I started getting into the cancer research. And what I got into was designing chemotherapy from vitamin A compounds. And that was definitely a crack in the ceiling of my previous paradigm. I had not been educated at all in nutrition. I could not have told you from a nutritional standpoint where vitamin A was well represented in our diet. I couldn't have told you beyond perhaps milk where calcium came from in our diet. I thought protein came from beef. I had all kinds of typical misperceptions of what nutrition meant. But as I started to see these vitamin A compounds killing cancer, and they do it through a unique mechanism, these compounds are capable of turning on cell suicide, which means that cancer can go away without an immune system getting involved. And that's a pretty profound and exciting turn that the whole cancer world was making around 2005, 2010. And it continues to try to turn this ship around. Previous to that, we really thought that we needed to bombard the tumors, with as much toxicity as possible, stress them out to the point where maybe the immune system could sweep in and try to clean up the mess. We're very well aware in the cancer world that our therapies really don't lead to cure. If somebody goes into long-term remission or cure, it's because their immune system finally caught up and cleared the cancer. And so that worldview started to fall apart a little bit as we started to realize, wait a second, nutrition is important. Nutrition has got something to do with how our bodies act. And around that time, UCLA, UCSD, some of these big universities were putting out some really fascinating data about the gut, the human gut, and the bacterial biome therein. And they were showing that if you have these bacteria, then you get this kind of cancer. If you got these kinds of bacteria, you get this kind of cancer. If you're lacking these bacteria, you get this disease. So lots of bizarre correlations were being made, but nobody, I think even to this day, really has wrapped their head around exactly how those are predicting outcomes. We know through which pathways they might happen, like epigenetics and some of these general pathways. MicroRNA now is the new frontier, but really there was a lack of information out there as to how those two things could be related. And so even in my world of cancer, it was starting to be clear that vitamin A can kill tumors, and the bacteria in the gut that deals with that food somehow predicts what type of cancer people get. So those were some of the cracks that were starting to put some stressors on my previous worldview. Then huge stress happened in academia, which was the financial collapse of the 2007 to 2010. And suddenly my Department of Endocrinology went from 75 faculty down to 25 faculty in the course of about 2 years. And so there was this implosion of funding, implosion of support for academic medicine. And so I was caught up in this maelstrom. And ultimately, I was too afraid to make the jump out of academia on my own. I wish I could say, Jeff, I reached this moment of enlightenment and knew the pathway, but instead, the reality is I just reached an utter dead end. Every single door shut on my 17-year journey to become a leading academician with kind of a worldwide expertise in cancer, whatever it was going to be, and all of that came to a screeching halt. And with that, I was left with the need, like every one of your listeners, everybody has to ultimately come to the point where you say in your life, okay, what a mess. What do I actually know for sure? And that usually boils down to an extremely short list.
Yeah, for sure.
All I knew was I'm Zach. I wake up every morning pretty convinced I'm Zach. I'm a doctor with a really crappy set of tools. I have not seen any of my patients that I've been taking care of for 9 years now. I haven't seen any of them really have any radical improvement in their life. They can improve on paper a little bit. Their numbers can get better here or there. Cholesterol looks better. Blood sugar looks better. But their health was crashing still. So really coming down to it, I was, had a house mortgage worth of school debt, 17 years invested. My family was exhausted. I was exhausted. And I didn't know how to run a small business. And so the jump out of academia was sheer terror. I didn't think I would ever think an intelligent thought again in my life. I thought I was going to be, they paint this horrible picture of outside academia as just treating colds and, scraped knees, and you're going to be bored out of your gourd. You're never going to advance anything. You'll never teach again. And so I was terrified that those things were true. But I did know something about nutrition. I had a few pearls that I had gotten out of my last couple of years there in academia, where I'd started reading a lot on nutrition. Dr. Neil Barnard was a very influential author. Read everything he had written. That led down to Dean Ornish and his program for reversing cardiovascular disease, and then going back, Gabe Merkel in the 1970s, writing the book on how to reverse cholesterol with a plant-based diet. And these guys really became my mentors without ever having met any of them. And reading on the nutrition, I was like, this is something that, given, if I really apply everything I've been taught, I might be able to get deeper into this stuff, because all the information out there on nutrition was very surfacey still. After the depth that I was coming out of, and where I was really thinking about intense molecular detail, to step back and look at what doctors were actually discussing about food, even as little as I knew it was scratching the surface. It was obvious that even the doctors that were leading the field in nutrition really didn't know what the heck was going on once that piece of food crossed your lips. Once it goes into that incredibly complex system of your gut, where you have ideally 40,000 species in this ecosystem that looks more like a rainforest than anything else, this massive, complex ecosystem takes over and starts dismantling those food items. And I just had this sense of, oh my gosh, we're at the tip of an iceberg, and I've got all of this molecular biology, I've got all this interesting cell biology, I got all this clinical research experience, I know how to put together clinical trials. Maybe there's a way to pull this all together. And so those were, intense insecurities, some, blue sky hope that this was all going to work into something that was cohesive. So in 2010, I made that jump to Revolution Health Center. Was in one of my biggest states of panic of my whole life the night before that clinic opened, because I was one doctor starting in one little renovated plumbing building. My son and I had spent 3 months tearing out rotten carpet and collapsing drop ceiling and renovating the space. And the whole 3 months I was, just trying to stave off panic that I was going to be a one doctor in a box practicing medicine alone. And that never happens to doctors these days. Very rarely does that happen. So, it never happens in the academic environment. You're buried in levels and levels of, specialists here, specialists there, residents, medical students. You have these massive non-cohesive teams that kind of disperse their sense of responsibility of being a doctor. So to go into a small town where I was seen as the doctor and expected to see and know something about everything that walked in my door was an overwhelming moment of insecurity. So I hope that paints a bleak enough picture as to where I started.
Yes, for sure. And Doc, I believe too, I read somewhere that in this town that most of the population did their shopping at the equivalent of the fuel stop. There wasn't actually like a health food store or anything of that nature in the town at the time.
That's right. So I was in Scottsville, which is a town of 550 people, and we had not yet had the Food Lion move in. Food Lion grocery store moved in 2 years after I opened my clinic. There was a funky rundown kind of processed food grocery there, but outside of that town is Buckingham County, and that county really is a food desert. And like you say, they're eating from Sheetz gas stations and the like. And so an absolute food desert. And that's largely why I set up shop there. Is it didn't feel like a really brave or contributory move to move to New York City and start a vegan, trendy clinic. And so I was trying to really, become an impact on some sort of very small level. And so moved there and was amazed by the reality that, the fifth generation poverty families that I was working with were way more capable of radical change in their lifestyle than the kind of CEO white collar people that were starting to hear about my clinic early on and were coming down to see what this kind of outside the box doctor was doing. These people who were still, only one generation away from eating from their backyards, it made total sense to them when I said, look, the food is screwing us up. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have any of the diseases we have today in the amount that we have. And they can immediately say, oh, yeah, that's right. My grandma or my mother grew this huge garden. We canned our food. We ate almost entirely from the ground. And now I haven't seen a garden. And all I do is eat from, the gas station. And I'm drinking soda and eating hot dogs. And, once you put those connections together in a human brain, especially in a brain of somebody who's suffering severe health problems where they can't afford their medicines, they can't hardly navigate through a complex medical system that's maybe only 25, 35 minutes up the road, but it's like a different planet to them when they arrive there, and they feel like they're just a cow being moved through the feedlot or something when they get into that medical machine. So for them to sit down with a doctor and spend an hour and a half just talking about their own health crisis and coming to realization that they had the ability and power to take their health back in their own hands was something that taught me hope again, I think, really. It taught me that humans are all striving for self and self-independence and self-wellness and self-care. We have this deep innate thing that's chasing that, but we don't even know it. It's so distracted by the sports and the TV and the Twitter and everything else that we pile into our day, the email lists and everything. We forget this just deep drive that we have in ourselves for self-care, self-improvement, self-excellence. And these people, my patients, one at a time, started to strip away some of my own insecurities, some of my own jaded sense of the world, and really taught me that not only is there hope, we should actually have the expectation of wellness. We should expect that everything should thrive. We certainly do when we put a seed in the ground. You plant a seed, you expect the sprout to come up, and then you expect that sprout to grow into a 4-foot tomato plant that just bursts with absolutely delicious tomatoes for 3 months and feeds your family. You expect that. We should have the same expectations of our own bodies, and that's an exciting shift.
I love that analogy. So, Doc, these days, a lot of your work centers around gut health. And specifically, let's talk about the environmental impacts. Like, what is, GMOs, pesticides, that sort of thing? What are the, I guess you could say, effects, really, on our gut health and human health in general?
Absolutely. This is kind of going to make me sound intelligent when I spit all this out. Realize that this is all retrospectively put together. I couldn't have put this story together prospectively. It's taken a bunch of scientists and public health experts that work with me now for all of us to put this cohesive story together. But when we take a look at the modern epidemics that we have, I think the most stunning one is just as far as its impact and emotional horror is autism. These poor children that are hit with this condition are in such a massive state of overwhelm that they can't look at somebody in the face. They can't make eye contact because it sends them into complete overwhelm. Their brains are literally in crisis mode constantly. And so that's maybe an epicenter point. So you got this autistic generation there. And if we look back in time, we didn't have nearly this burden of autism just 20 years ago. We did have vaccinations 20 years ago. So, there's a lot of kind of theories out there. Maybe the vaccines are doing, maybe this is doing, but there's something different that happened in the last 20 years, and it's gotten worse and worse. So our rate of autism 4 years ago was 1 in 64, and just this past year, so over a 3-year period, went from 1 to 64 down to 1 in 42, something like that. And so, even in the course of 3-4 years, you can see the epidemic accelerating. And so something has changed. Something is still actively involved. And that's really going to point back to what you're talking about, which is the food chain. Let's go back to like World War II. So World War II, at the end of the war, we had grown an amazing amount of food in our backyards. They were called victory gardens. And the victory gardens by 1945 were growing 45% of the American food supply. That is stunning. And so we are currently growing somewhere around 1/1000th of a percent of our food supply in our backyards. And so to think that just 60 years ago we were growing that much food in our backyards gardens really speaks to the problem. And what switched from 1945 to current day is really a story of convenience. We have been, as a population, this is not some big business, devious plan. I think the big business was just stepping up to basically answer our call for convenience. And so you saw this happen after World War II. What happened? We created the TV dinner. We created Wonder Bread. We created the Twinkie. We created all of this bizarre, engineered, highly refined, highly processed foods that were really resembling chemicals more than they were nutrients. And that was done out of this excitement that, oh my gosh, we just got refrigeration. We don't need to can and pickle and ferment everything anymore. We can simply just throw it in the refrigerator. And oh my gosh, we can build strip malls with grocery stores so you no longer have to grow everything. You can simply bop down the road and pick up your produce every couple days, and everything was getting easier and easier. Oh, don't worry about soaking your dried beans and all that. We got canned beans. At every level of the food chain, we were finding avenues towards convenience, and big business was always happy to give us better and better options towards that convenience angle. Insidiously, what was happening is we were losing our ecosystem. What was pitched as just an incredible humanitarian goal of feeding the world. We created this whole movement in the 1950s and 60s called the Green Health Revolution. Sounds fantastic. And ironically, that's exactly what I called Revolution Health Center when I first started. I had this whole page called the Green Health Revolution. I think actually there's remnants of it still on my rudimentary website. I didn't know at the time that I had picked the same name as this now in retrospect, horrific movement of mechanized, chemicalized food production. But we called it the Green Revolution. And what was happening is that we had all this devastated soil. Everybody remembers the Dust Bowl stories that none of us had to live through, but we all remember the pictures and glimpses in the moving pictures and stuff like that of those huge dust clouds moving across the Midwest. For sure. That was devastated soil. And so we had destroyed our soil pre-World War II through our early efforts at mechanized farming. We didn't understand crop rotation. We had lost generational knowledge of thousands of years, and we were killing our soil. Come out of World War II, we suddenly had this huge glut of petroleum products. And so it turns out that petroleum products, oil, is rich in nitrogen, and nitrogen makes plants green. And so we started dumping our petroleum not into the war machine, but into our soils. And what we saw is a massive, speedy recovery of green plants. The crop yield went up massively per acre. We were suddenly able to grow food on what had just been a year before that dead soil. And we no longer were doing composting. We no longer had to do all this complex farm planning. Just dump more and more petroleum product into the soil, and things got green. What we didn't realize is we were killing bacteria. We were not fueling and feeding the bacterial environment, and we were pouring chemical toxins into that soil. And so we were losing bacteria. When you lose bacteria in the soil, either the soil of the earth or the soil of your gut, both ecosystems very similar, you start to lose the ability to liberate nutrients. And so now imagine a tomato plant in 1945 in the backyard of your grandmother's house growing. The tomato was full of lycopene, all of these incredible anti-cancer compounds. Fast forward just 10 years to the end of the 50s, we were starting to grow tomatoes in soil that no longer had the nutrients available. We didn't have the bacteria that could pull the nutrients out of the soil, even if they were there. And the plants were starting to grow fruit that was deplete in nutrients. Now you fast forward 50 years and we have, a radical, bizarre environment where most of the tomatoes that are on the grocery store shelf aren't even grown in soil. They're grown in hydroponic systems, so they never touch the soil so that they're exposed to less bugs and all of this. But ultimately, they are not touching the complexity and beauty of nature's ecosystem. And so our food is becoming devoid in nutrients. When they become devoid in nutrients, the plants themselves become really prone to disease. Let me say that again. When a plant becomes nutrient deficient, it becomes prone to disease. That's exactly the human condition. When we become nutrient depleted, we become disease vulnerable. And so we started to see all of these diseases move into the plants and the crops in the 1960s, and we responded with more chemical. And so the war machine with Vietnam was dialing down. The chemical company that was involved with Agent Orange and all that was a small company called Monsanto. They turned their energies towards the agricultural environment with this chemical industry. And they weren't alone. Almost all of the chemical companies started turning their attention to big ag because the potential monetary outcome was huge. But Monsanto, perhaps better than any other company, really made an incredible business plan. And their business plan started with, well, let's build some chemicals that help kill the bugs and the weeds. Because if a farmer doesn't have to weed his crops, then how much more can he grow? How many fewer people can he hire? And so they started to really increase less the crop yield, I would say, and much more the farmer's labor efficiency by adding these chemicals of the herbicides and pesticides. In 1976, they made a bold move. They bought a patent or bought a chemical and patented it. The chemical was called glyphosate, Glyphosate, glyphosate. And they purchased glyphosate from a tiny little biotech company, and they patented it as an antibiotic, not as an herbicide or a pesticide. And that patented compound would become the mainstay ingredient in a huge product that became known as Roundup. And there's other toxins in Roundup. There's other chemicals in there that can kill weeds and damage plant life. But glyphosate was clearly the majority player in that chemical equation that they put together for that weed killer. And what it does is it inhibits the ability of enzymes and bacteria to get nutrients out of the soil. And so by inhibiting the nutrient delivery, it can kill the weed really quickly. And so if you spray the weed, can't get any nutrients, it dies within a couple of hours to days. And so we started spraying something into the soil that not only killed bacteria, it was an antibiotic, but it also was seizing up the machinery's ability to liberate nutrients from a soil that already was 30 years deplete from poor farming techniques, lack of crop rotation, lack of composting, lack of soil care. And so this was 1976 where we started adding it. And they had to be very careful with it because if you sprayed it on the corn or the soybean or the wheat, it would kill it. And so they were just spot spraying with it. Then in the 1980s, in an effort to increase sales of glyphosate and Roundup, Monsanto got permission to go direct to the consumer. And they started selling these chemical compounds to the consumer in the form of Roundup. And perhaps some of us remember the Super Bowl commercials of the 1980s and maybe even early 90s where you saw these guys walking out of their garage with a backpack of Roundup and these pistol grip sprayers, dramatic soundtrack, and they'd walk down their driveway and spray the 3 dandelions that were there in the driveway. On a side note, dandelions are a superfood that kill cancer, but nonetheless, they're killing these dandelions without even having to bend over and pick them out of the cracks. That became one of the most effective ad campaigns in history, and pretty soon every single consumer through all of our suburban sprawl felt the need to have a little bottle, if not a backpack sprayer of Roundup. And so by the 1980s, we're starting to pour this stuff down our driveways. It's leaching off of our gardens and off of our lawns into our municipal water system. And so unthinkingly, we start drinking this compound. And so by the late 80s, we're drinking increasing amounts of a chemical that both kills bacteria and inhibits other bacteria from liberating nutrients into our bodies. By the late 1980s, we were starting to see a huge epidemic of chronic disease. Autoimmune diseases were starting to come on, but nobody was talking about it at the time. It was still focused on heart disease. We thought heart disease was our number one killer and always would be. And so we were focused on really developing the statins and more blood pressure medicines and all of these cholesterol control techniques and everything else. We developed the 5-vessel coronary bypass graft in the 70s, really the 60s, but perfected that in the 70s. And by the 80s, we had chest pain centers all over the world to treat heart disease. So we were very focused on that. But below that, we started to see this huge, rapid increase of type 2 diabetes. And that was kind of the harbinger of there was something massively wrong in the guts of humans. Type 2 diabetes is really a disorder that stems directly from liver inflammation and inflammation of the gut lining. That makes us insulin resistant, pancreas can't keep up, and blood sugar eventually goes up. But the whole blood sugar part of diabetes is a way late-breaking feature of it. It's more of a symptom. It's certainly not the disease, but it really is a condition of inflammation. Pretty quickly after that, you start to see an increase in autoimmune diseases and lots of other arthritic conditions, lupus, mixed connective tissue disorder. And then by the 90s, things really started to get out of hand. We made a couple of big shifts. In 1992, Monsanto came up with a great campaign to their farmers. They said, okay, we know it's dangerous. Your guys are barely using Roundup because it's going to kill your crop, and we understand that. But maybe there's an opportunity here to really increase your crop yield by killing your plants early. And the plant that was most obvious was wheat. In northern climates, you can only grow one cycle of wheat. You have to wait for the grass to grow, you have to wait for it to die and dry, and then once it's dry, then you can cut it, it drops, you leave it on the ground for 2 days, you hope it doesn't rain, and then you get it up off the ground into the harvesting process. All of a sudden, Monsanto said, you know what? You don't have to sit around there and watch your wheat dry. That's incredibly time laborious. And why don't you just spray the entire field with Roundup? In 3 days, it's going to be dead, and you can harvest it. And sure enough, they could. And so in 1992, this practice went into play, and it was called a ripening agent or a desiccant, which means drying agent. And so a ripening agent or a drying agent is how they marketed it. But ultimately what it was a death knell to the wheat. And so they could sweep in mid-season, spray the wheat that was now starting to go to seed, but it hadn't started to dry yet, and they would spray the whole crop with the Roundup, kill the crop, be dead in 3 days, harvest it, and then they could put a second crop in and actually get 2 crops out of a single growing season. This seemed to be a panacea and massive game changer for a northern climate farmer. And so suddenly getting 2 crops a year instead of 1, that's a no-brainer from an economic standpoint. You know, of course, you do have to add in there the amount of cost of spraying your entire 10,000-acre farm or 100,000-acre farm with glyphosate, which is significant. Roundup cost was there. But nonetheless, if it increases 20%, it probably doesn't double your yield because you're spending giving a lot to Monsanto. But if you can increase your yield by 20%, that's a great business decision. Every single year since 1992, we've had somewhere between a 30 and 300-fold increase in number of acres worldwide sprayed with Roundup of our wheat. Starting in 1992, we started to see a linear increase in a condition that at the time or previous to this had been very rare, and that was celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease to a component of wheat, which is a breakdown product of gluten. That compound is called gliadin. And so we can develop this autoimmune condition to wheat. And that had really, before 1992, been unheard of. It was certainly described, but certainly the public had never heard of it. By 2000, the public was hearing about this. Suddenly, amazing amount of people were being diagnosed with celiac disease. And if you overlap the number of acres of wheat sprayed with Roundup to the rate in the population of celiac disease, they overlap perfectly. And so for every increase in the acre sprayed, we have a linear and matched increase in the rate of celiac disease in the public. And so what a stunning example of what was happening. Then 1996 happened. 1996 will go down as probably one of the biggest human mistakes that we've ever made, which is as a population, we went ahead and moved forward with a genetically modified compound that can go to seed and spread its genetically modified state all over the world. And that was, again, this company, Monsanto. And so Monsanto, out of sheer energy to sell more Roundup, created genetically modified crops. If you remember, they used to actually tell you and market it as Roundup Ready crops. Mm-hmm. They don't use that term anymore, and that's for a lot of reasons. But that's how we were told about them in 1996. Oh my gosh, we have Roundup Ready crops, which means you can spray the entire cornfield, the entire soybean field, and not damage those crops, but get all the weeds out. What a panacea. And so went from a few farmers in 1996, with their huge farms that needed some sort of technological breakthrough to reduce costs off their massive harvesting efforts, went to these GMO crops. There were test fields, and EPA was doing some monitoring and everything else, and very quickly it became obvious that that seed was blowing around. And Monsanto, as many of you probably know, used that to their advantage and started suing all of the farmers nearby those fields to say, you're now growing our patented soybean or our patented corn. You need we're going to put you out of business. And they would sue these farmers until they were in a state where they had to either go out of business or fold, settle, and start growing GMO crops. And so from 1996 to 2006, we saw this amazing state of just a few farmers to 96% of the soybean in the country being grown genetically modified, and about 85% of the corn in the country being genetically modified. So this one of the most successful business plans ever implemented, I think, has got to go to Monsanto on that front.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, that's quite the picture, Doc.
May have gotten a longer answer than you were looking for on that one.
Well, no, that's good. I mean, that really paints a picture of what the current state of affairs looks like, where it stems from, and really what it is. And it's I think it's a lot bigger than most of us realize. I know I'm privy to GMOs, understanding the gluten intolerance that's shown up. But to really understand how far-reaching it is, and those implications, that's huge. Now, Dr. Bush, when you translate this conversation of glyphosates, of Roundup, into how that affects gut health, what does that look like in terms of the human condition? Like, once this is ingested, I know that you speak a bit about leaky gut and really these tight junctions that exist not just in the gut, but in all cells in the body. Can you speak to that, how that translates?
Fantastic. So I was running my nutrition clinic. 2010s opened up, and after 2 years of practicing very intensive nutrition, I was kale juicing my patients into oblivion. I was feeding them more vegetables than any human has been able to get in their body before. I thought I'm a kind of an extreme personality, and encourage my patients down these extreme pathways of, well, if it's good for you, a ton of it's got to be even better. And so I felt like at the forefront of nutrition medicine, and I was helping people get out of their diabetes and all kinds of wonderful things, seeing a ton of cancer patients, autoimmune patients, and seeing some amazing results. But there was a lot of them that were not responding. In fact, if I put healthy food in their guts got worse. They actually felt sicker, more bloating, more distended, and the only thing they could really tolerate was refined carbohydrates. They knew that was the last thing in the world they should be eating, but it's the only thing they felt well on. And it was that kind of 40-50% of the population that really sent me down the avenue of understanding, how does this whole farming industry actually tie into the human gut and human health? And so in 2012, me and my colleague that was working in my clinic at the time, William, we were talking about this issue of soil and what's happened in the soil. And the whole story that I just told you was unknown to me at the time. I had a vague understanding, much like the rest of the public, that there was Monsanto and things like Roundup, but I had no idea on their nature or their impact on it. But we were starting to ask questions about the soil and starting to say, maybe the food that we are feeding them isn't the same kale that all the studies were done with in the 1960s and 70s with, all of our Colin Campbell data from the China study and all this. That's old science in the sense that the plants we grew were different. So we were saying, well, maybe something's wrong with the plant, or maybe something's wrong with the soil. And we were thinking definitely down the nutrient deficiency state, not really the chemical state at the time. But he brought in a 90-page white paper on soil science, and I was flipping through this thing quickly, busy clinic, patients waiting, not even reading anything, just kind of getting an impression, flipped a page, and time stopped. It was one of those moments where you just feel like the universe pulls the blinders off. In that moment, in the center of this little white page, is this large carbon molecule that has about 8 different oxygen-hydrogen binding sites hanging off one end of it. And it stopped me in my tracks, And I said, that looks confusingly like the chemotherapy I was making at the University of Virginia. What is that doing in soil? It took us a couple more weeks of just kind of reading and sorting things out to figure out that thing was being made by bacteria. And that was the game changer for me. At that moment, I knew if we could get that molecule out of soil and into a human, we would see something really dramatic in the cancer world. I was still very much in my Western medicine mindset, very much in my cancer training mindset. But I knew something radical was changing in my perception of reality, because up to this moment, I thought that cell-cell communication, which over the course of 2000 to 2010 had become kind of the holy grail of not just cancer, but autoimmune disease and chronic inflammation itself. If we could get cells to talk to each other well, they can heal each other well. They repair, they repair, they repair, they repair. If they have a lack of information, they don't know what needs to be repaired and they don't kick into action. And so longevity itself is really based around our ability to do cell-cell communication perfectly. And up until that moment of 2012, when I saw that molecule, I thought that the entire communication network was made by mitochondria. These things look like bacteria, but they live inside of our cells, and there are many of them, somewhere around 14 quadrillion in your body when you're age 2. That number decreases over your lifetime because they are affected heavily by the toxins that you eat. They kill mitochondria quickly. And so mitochondrial stress has been, over the last 10 years, really recognized to be a large part of the aging process. Mitochondria, it turns out, are like bacteria, the things that digest the food in your cells. And so sugar and fat are the only two things that can come out of your diet that ultimately turn into fuel for the human cell. But interestingly, sugar and fat are useless to the human machinery there, and the only thing that can use it is the mitochondria, which is ultimately a non-human species. There's 3 species of mitochondria. Each have slight changes in their DNA composition. But their genome, their DNA, looks more like a virus than it does human. None of this double helix stuff that we have in the human genome. It's a ring genome. It's a little circle of DNA, and it's very non-human in its origin. And those guys, those little non-human entities, 14 quadrillion in your body, are really the nursemaids and the communication network. But they only exist in multicellular organisms. Mitochondria only happen if you have a multicellular organism. And so a worm or a fruit fly or a human, all of us have mitochondria. But single-cell organisms like the bacteria of the soil or the bacteria in your gut don't have mitochondria. And so in this instant of looking at that molecule, it was like, oh my gosh, I've been sitting here studying nutrition, talking about bacteria, thinking about probiotics, thinking bacteria are good. It never dawned on me that they did not have mitochondria, therefore did not have a communication network. Well, that's impossible. How could an ecosystem of 14 or 40,000 species stay balanced and stay working together cohesively if they didn't communicate? They have to communicate. And since they don't have mitochondria, they would have to make their own redox, positive, negative charge, oxygen communication network. And sitting in the middle of this page was this large carbon molecule with all these oxygen-hydrogen binding sites ready to do redox biochemistry. And so it was this exciting moment. I was like, oh my gosh, every single cancer study I've ever done, every single patient I've ever looked at, I have been thinking of them as if they were sterile. I would have been thinking of them as a human in a petri dish. I forgot about the biome. I forgot that there was this ecosystem that way outnumbered them. A human has 70 trillion cells. That's a big number. It's about the same as our national debt. 70 trillion cells. But the bacteria number 1.4 quadrillion, and mitochondria 14 quadrillion. And so we are logarithmically outnumbered by these non-human entities. And everything you've ever read about health and human disease has failed to take into consideration the possibility that the bacteria are talking. And if that's true, I knew we had a paradigm shift on our hands, and that's what led us down to our current state of getting to. And so it took us about 6 months to get the first bottles stable. We've made every bottle of Restore since then in our labs here in Virginia. And it's again, interesting how life runs. All of you who are listening are on your own life journey. You guys are on a life journey that when you look back on it, can often feel a little frustrating because you think, oh my gosh, I spent all this time doing this job or in this schooling, and nothing ever came out of that. I wasted time here. I don't think there's any wasted time. Every single thing you've done has an application in your future. Every single thing you've done, as maybe off track as it was and as confused as its source was and as half-truth as it was loaded with, every single one of those things is moving you towards your moment. It's moving you towards that higher state of thinking, higher state of knowledge, higher state of contribution to humanity as we make this decision. Are we going to just annihilate our world, and are we going to die as a species, or are we going to shift? And so I believe that everybody, myself included right now, is unbeknownst to us being steered down this corridor where everything that we were taught, probably through a completely non-sustainable methodology and a completely non-sustainable worldview or model, all of that can be flipped around in an instant. And in an instant, you can suddenly realize, oh my gosh, it all makes sense. And it's not complicated. It's simple. And all of these truths that you have filed away in your spirit and filed away in your mind, filed away in that peripheral water in your muscle, everywhere else, you have all this data that's waiting to be restructured into a really cohesive mission for your life. And that's my last 4 years in a nutshell. I have gone from a depressed and confused doctor practicing a very fractured state of understanding of chronic disease management and maybe a little bit of health there and some nutrition to one of the most organized, clinical models for human health that I think is out there, not because I'm amazing, but because the universe is amazing. All of us are coming into our moment. All of us are right here at this turning point of saying, this is why I'm here. This is what we can do together. This is how communication works. And for me, that communication started down at these bacteria, talking together. But it's quickly led to the reality that if you start speaking on the cellular level, there's an immediate and parallel response at the macro system. So your brain, your spirit, your community, everything you do starts to communicate better. And you become more potent, you become a better educator, you become a better learner, you become a better listener, you become a better speaker. All of these things start happening because you have clarity on the cellular level. You have communication going on the cell level. And when everything starts to resonate, frequency is there. There's cohesive resonance in your body and in your mind and in your spirit. You become very, very potent. You become a potent agent for change in a world that's absolutely heading to its endpoint of non-sustainability. That pendulum is about to swing back, and everything you've done to date is preparing you perfectly for that next chapter.
That was awesome, Doc. Fantastic. So as far as Restore goes, the product itself, give us the short version of, the best ways to, if this product's for you, is it for everybody? How to just kind of assess how to get started with Restore, and maybe even some of the initial signs, what to expect when first taking it.
So Restore became the first product in a pipeline of products that are coming out around these bacterial communication network. And so these carbon molecules made by the bacteria when they digest your food are all these oxygen-hydrogen binding sites available for doing cell-cell communication. And we put this into clinical trials with my cancer patients almost immediately. We had finished a little bit of safety data. We'd finished a little bit of understanding on how it was interacting with cancer cells. And so we put this into play. And within days, hours or days, we were seeing things happen that I had no explanation for. And what was happening is that the people were actually reducing inflammation ultimately. And I knew that the compound itself was not an anti-inflammatory. Is not a direct anti-inflammatory. It has an enormous ability to rebuild these fundamental barrier systems or firewalls between the outside world and your cells. These barrier systems are laced together and really dependent upon these small protein structures called tight junctions. Definitely need a better marketing team for the tight junction. Difficult concept to say and not a really pretty term. But these guys are absolutely your most important partners. Without the tight junction, there is no cohesive and coherent membranes. Membranes are the macro result of hundreds of millions, hundreds of billions of human cells all tied together in a cohesive, single purpose. And so your gut is probably your best example of this. Your gut covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. It's about 6 or 8 times the size of your skin surface area. So massive surface area there. And that surface area is composed of all of these billions of tiny microscopic cells. And all of those cells have one goal of protecting and keeping out the things that should not get into your body and bringing in and transporting all of the nutrients and critical features that you do need from your environment. And so that intelligent membrane is put together and maintained and really coordinated by these little tight junctions. They are way more than just a structural protein. These guys have their own intelligence to them. But these little tight junctions look like Velcro between the cells, and they, like a hook and eye, they lace the cell together, and they create a carpet of intestinal cells. And now you have an apical cell where the food passes on, and you have the bloodstream and immune system on the backside. When you start Restore, something dramatic happens to those tight junctions. And this is visible under the microscope. When you're looking at a small bowel or colon membrane, you can see this happen within 3 to 5 minutes, and then within 16, 20 minutes, it's just radical. You can actually see a time-lapse video of 16 minutes of action on the small intestine on our website, which is restore, the number 4life.com, restore4life.com. That website, you can see this little 16-second time-lapse film of 16 minutes of time under the microscope. And in those 16 minutes, you can see Restore strengthen and increase the number of tight junctions in the gut membrane. While in the unprotected membrane, we've exposed both membranes to Roundup, and it's actually just one component of the Roundup, which is the glyphosate compound, the antibiotic-type herbicide component. We expose both membranes to glyphosate, and if it's not protected by the carbon redox molecule of the bacteria, that membrane destroys in 16 minutes. You've got utter destruction of the tight junctions, and that system has become a profound leaky sieve. You had mentioned the leaky gut concept earlier. Mm-hmm. It's really this breakdown of those tight junctions and this leaky sieve effect of the Roundup that has led to this massive burden of chronic disease, chronic inflammation in our population. We didn't have gluten sensitivity before we started spraying this stuff in our food. We didn't have autoimmune disease at the rates we have today. We didn't have autism at the rates we have today. We don't have any of this. Does the herbicide cause autism? No. What causes autism is a breakdown in the immune system and that tight junction firewall in front of the immune system, and a complete overwhelm ensues. And when overwhelmed, that immune system becomes its own problem. We call it oxidative stress. Oxidation is rust. It's rusting. And so your whole system starts rusting as this leaky gut event happens. And with that advent of chronic inflammation, all hell breaks loose. You got autoimmune diseases in some people, you got the diabetes in some people, you got major depression in some people, you got chronic anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, infertility, poor sex drive, go on down the list. That condition of being leaky is really at the foundation of our current crisis. Chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain syndromes. It goes on and on and on. My daily life as a doctor and in a clinic right now, it's just, there's not a patient that walks in that doesn't have some version of the same thing. And that's actually encouraging on some levels. As frustrating and as decimating as it's been to human health, what good news that there's only one problem ultimately, is that our immune systems are overwhelmed from a leaky barrier system. And when you put this Restore compound into the process, Restore doesn't heal any disease. Restore simply puts back these foundational communication networks that allow the body to do what it does best and all the time, which is heal. And so the reason, like you said, Jeff, is you've seen family members, you've seen close friends and relatives on the product, and they've reported miracles. It's not the compound that's delivering the miracles. The body is the miracle. Healing is inherently miraculous. And every one of us have this miraculous capacity for infinite repair. If a cell gets damaged, if it has the right information at hand, it just simply turns on all the machinery for cell repair and fixes itself. If it's damaged to the point where it can't fix itself, it simply turns on the mechanisms of cell suicide, kills itself, stem cell moves in, replaces that cell within minutes, and you're up and running again within a day or two. And so you've got this massive repair system that's capable of, as far as we can tell, the biology level, infinite repair and reconstruction and longevity. We shouldn't be talking about lifespans of 100 years. We should be talking about lifespans of 1,000 years. We have all the machineries and mechanisms of the cell level to achieve that. We just don't have enough communication happening. And so when you take Restore, you're going to experience something that's unique to you, which is your body healing. That's going to be different than my body healing. It's going to be different than Jeff's body healing. Your body is going to take its own course. When you start putting into the foundational system of cell-cell communication, intact firewalls, and a catch-up period and rebuilding these reservoirs in your immune system, your body's going to start healing, and it's going to heal in the order of priority. Your body's order of priority may not be your own priority. And so one of the biggest mistakes people do when they head into any healing journey is say, I'm going to say this thing succeeds or fails based on if my left elbow stops hurting. They pick some random thing that seems important to them and is important to them, and they decide that's going to be the harbinger of success or failure of whatever intervention they're making. Well, the body doesn't think about that. Your body, the pain in your left elbow is not the problem. The problem is you have hundreds of millions of unrepaired, damaged blood vessel cells that are putting you at risk for a stroke, heart attack, or you have a population of 10 million breast cancer cells that have been chronically acidic and are about to make the transformation into a cancer. These are kind of the invisible frontiers that the body's going to put its healing energy initially. And so when you start a product, there may be a period of time, especially if you're pretty healthy, where you're not going to really notice that much. But if you're past the age of 1, you're experiencing some state of nutrient deficiency. Just as a human being right now, I can say with great confidence, 100% of people past the age of 1 have some shape or form of nutrient deficiency. And actually, I think that's probably true at the moment of birth. We're all nutrient deficient at the time of birth because our mothers are no longer nutrient replete, and so they're having babies that are nutrient deficient, et cetera, et cetera. And so as you start a compound like Restore that not only creates cell-cell communication, but it makes your own bacteria start to blossom. We see bacterial recovery in 4 days. People go from sterile colons, from chemotherapy and chronic antibiotics for chronic Lyme disease and all kinds of other things, to actually these large, bulky bowel movements with an amazing amount of beneficial flora in 4 days. Keep in mind that the product is sterile. It doesn't have any bacteria. All it is the communication network between the bacteria. Well, that turns out to be a panacea for us because up until this moment, it was probiotics. We thought probiotics were how you get gut health. So we would give probiotics and digestive enzymes. Basically, you're trying to microengineer a very complicated system with very rudimentary tools when you're using those two. A probiotic typically has 3 to 7 species of bacteria at copies of 35 billion. And so if you take 35 billion copies of the same 3 bacteria every day or 3 times a day, you end up with a monoculture. You've heard of monoculture in the agricultural environment, and it's a bad thing. It's also a horrific thing in the gut. You do not want monoculture in your intestines. You want an amazing amount of biodiversity. And so in pursuit of that biodiversity, it turns out that the secret's not adding more bacteria, it's adding back the communication network. And once the communication network is there, the gut knows exactly what it needs. And it's going to find these tiny little species that are underrepresented hiding out in some places of the gut. There was just an amazing realization that the appendix of the human gut has up until now been told to everybody it's a useless remnant of our mutation from a rabbit that has a huge appendix to the human that has a very tiny appendix because we don't eat wood anymore, so we don't need appendix. It's just a remnant of, well, it turns out that thing is actually a time capsule of the bacterial biome. Many of our very difficult to grow and very difficult to isolate bacteria species hang out there in the appendix ready to repopulate the gut after a gastrointestinal infection or an antibiotic wipeout or chemotherapy. Ultimately, that gut can start to repopulate if enough communication gets in there and the appendix or whatever else, a little pocket behind the tonsils or all these other sources say, oh, there's a lack of bacteria out there. We just need to proliferate. And so they start proliferating. So not only is it coming out of the gut in these little hidden pockets or time capsules of biome, it's actually coming from your environment. You actually breathe bacteria all day long without thinking about it. We call them air plankton, these old dry or partially hydrated bacteria that are floating around in our environment. We breathe those guys into our sinuses, into our mouths, and we start to repopulate the gut. Communication network there with lots of Restore, you suddenly get all those species get a foothold, start to communicate, start to proliferate, and repopulate the gut.
Fantastic. It sounds like a full picture solution here, Doc.
And ultimately, that's what communication is, isn't it? And that's
it is.
the
It's
fun
neat.
shift is no longer are we saying you need lots of vitamin C or, boy, vitamin D is the problem. Nobody has vitamin D. You got to super load everybody on vitamin D. Those are tiny, tiny little symptoms of life without nature. But you add back a communication network, and suddenly you get this really robust result where you've got ecosystem happening, you got cell repair happening, you got longevity happening. You ultimately get clarity at the cell level of who you are. Cells start to know who they are, and they continue to preserve that. They maintain that health. And again, just like we spoke on earlier, that happens at the macro level. Clarity as to who you are, what is your purpose, what is your next chapter. I'm excited to hear from you guys on the flip side of this, because I think all of you who are in pursuit of a higher purpose, a higher vibration of your own, you're going to find out the Restore is part of your journey, not because it's a great product, because it's part of the inherent structure of nature. Communication from the bacteria is missing in your life. You're going to put it back in, and when you do, all kinds of transformation is going to happen on the micro level and on the macro level, and I'm excited for you guys to impact my world.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Bush. And just a couple 1, 2, 3 word answers, questions I have for you as we wrap this up. And the first one is just, what keeps you motivated to continue doing the work you do?
My kids is the short answer to that. Kids 18, 16, 10 years old, their generation, look at what they're facing. The highest level of chronic disease ever in human history, biggest financial debts ever in human history. They're going to support the largest geriatric community ever in human history. They're going to have the highest disease rate in their peers in human history. We're going to be looking at diabetes rates at 1 in 2 by 2030, 50% of the adult population with diabetes. Can you imagine what's going to happen with major depression, anxiety, all of these? It's going to be the most tragic situation if we don't turn this ship around fast. So my kids and their generation, I can't sit here idle. They would get me out of bed every day and push me to get something done.
Beautiful. And now, do you use one specific strategy, whether it's a daily practice or a ritual, to help yourself evolve and go to your own next level?
My daily ritual is be willing to destroy anything that I think is true. I am in constant willingness to have somebody tell me something or universe show me something that destroys what I thought was true before. I'm ready to keep deconstructing until I just have truth to work with.
Awesome. And Dr. Bush, if you had to guide your life by one quote, yours or one you've heard, what would that be?
The one guiding thing that I wish and hope and ultimately I think know, let me rephrase that. I do know that we're capable of coming to as a people is the concept that I am enough. We need to become comfortable enough in our own skin, in our own identities to know that we are enough. We don't need to be anything that we aren't. We don't need to fake anything. We don't need to, jump through anybody else's hoops. We are enough. I am enough. And when I sleep deep in that, I think I wake up healthy and recharged and ready to go again. And I hope that my children know that they are enough. I hope that they know they don't have to please anybody else. They don't have to jump through somebody else's belief system to be their ultimate self. And so I am enough.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And what's the best place for people to get in touch with you? RestoreForLife.com, or like just to find your, to find your best, not really to get in touch with you, just to tune into your message, I guess is the better way to say it.
Well, that's a bit of an existential one too, but I think that ultimately I want to be in touch with all of you. I love that, and we have a huge customer service group that's wonderful people. RestoreForLife.com is the website. We have a customer service line if you need help there, but we have fantastic tools online. All of the science is there. Many of my lectures are posted there. Follow us on Facebook is a really helpful thing. Where our social media group is phenomenal. Abby is always on top of answering questions, getting information to the public. She's a powerhouse in just social change. So Abby and our social media group there is a powerful thing. So follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. A lot of ideas going out every day over the Twitter lines. So we're fully engaged in a worldwide effort for communication. So go to the website, get engaged there. Go to your Facebook, get engaged there. But then as soon as you learn our science, please get engaged with your legislators. Start calling people and just saying, this is unacceptable. We have to stop spraying glyphosate. It's no longer just Monsanto. It went off patent in 2007. Now, something like 90% of the herbicides on the market have glyphosate in it. We are dumping 1.2 billion pounds of Roundup into our soil just this year alone. And so it's just a travesty of human health and planetary health that we are participating in. And the more we know and the more we communicate our distaste for our current condition, the faster it will change. And I really believe that it's not a product that's going to save the world. It's consciousness, it's communication, it's love of one another, love for our children that's going to change it. So get engaged in your greater community, and in so doing, you will also be communicating with me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Bush, and be well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to your community.
There you have it. That wraps up another episode of the Next Level Podcast. I know this episode was packed with tons of information and science around the product, and I hope you got a lot out of it. For the resources and show notes from today's episode, head on over to jeffagustinelli.com/029 or jeffa.co/029.